My grief is my castle, which, like an eagle's nest, is built high up on the mountain peaks, among the clouds. Nothing can storm it. From it, I fly down into reality and seize my prey. But I do not remain down there. I bring it home with me, and this prey is a picture I weave into the tapestries of my palace. There I live as one dead. I immerse everything I have experienced in a baptism of forgetfulness unto an eternal remembrance. Everything finite and accidental is forgotten and erased. Then I sit, like an old man, gray haired and thoughtful, and explain the pictures in a voice as soft as a whisper. And at my side, a child sits and listens, although he remembers everything before I tell it. Soren Kierkegaard, Either or, A Fragment of Life. The pursuit of anime is an aim to explore philosophical topics through the medium of anime, to create discussion and to enlighten ourselves. We are by no means professionals, and the content of this podcast is pure discussion meant to stimulate and exercise our minds, and hopefully yours too. So you're joined here today by myself, Raven, and and Teddy on the other side of the line.
Hello.
Yeah, and here we're discussing Bleach and Kierkegaardian grief. Very specific topic, but I think it's very relevant and can teach us a lot about not just grief but ourselves. So just to kick it right off, Soren Kierkegaard has this quote where he describes grief as being the most painful state. Um, so he says the most painful state of being is remembering the future, particularly the one you'll never have. So for Soren Kierkegaard, grief was something that was silent, it was solitary, and it was something that was almost secretive and seeking to retire into itself. For him, that visceral sense of mortality we got after experiencing grief was something he labeled as despair. And in this kind of almost long night of despair, that's when we can begin the journey to realize our truest selves. Or, I guess, in his ideology, that was the only way, in some cases, that we could begin the journey to realize our truest selves. So, in other words, when we meaningfully encounter firsthand that things in life are not eternal and nothing is forever, aka existentialism, we appreciate how we passionately long for things to be eternal. That source of despair is that we want that forever. We seek the eternal. So for Kierkegaard, the only way to overcome despair, to relieve this human condition, is to surrender into it. There is an eternal by which we lose ourselves in. There is faith, and grief is the dark marble door to belief. Now, take this to Bleach. Ichigo starts off the story, and he is always downcast by rain. It's raining when his mother dies. It's raining whenever he loses a fight and enters that kind of limbo world with Zangetsu and his white self. And the rain is there to represent kind of the chaos that's in his soul. It's representative of how he feels inside.
Like the melancholy inside of him. Yeah.
Yeah, the despair and the feeling of powerlessness and self-loathing over his inability to protect his mother, which is something that was prevalent from like the first few episodes, right?
Mhm.
Now you progress through the story, and Ichigo eventually starts finding strength in protecting others, in protecting the family that he still had and the one that he was building. And this is what allowed him to overcome grief. So when he went to save Rukia, he could have easily chosen to stay in the world of the living and forget all about soul society, sever all bonds, and move on. Remember, like when Renji came with Byakuya, right? And they just bodied Ichigo. They left him on the sidewalk,
Oh
just
then,
stranded.
yeah.
You remember that, right, Teddy?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. It was an embarrassing moment for Ichigo.
He's always
They
in
made
those
this man
moments.
look like light work. Yeah.
And Rukia gave him a way out. She's like, "Listen, I don't even know this guy. Like like we knew each other for like a few weeks. Just like forget about me. Don't even think about coming to Soul Society." you have a way out. Just stay in the world of living. It's like nothing ever happened. I'll just die and it'll be fine. So Ichigo, did theoretically have like kind of a way out, a way back to normalcy, right?
Hmm.
But the problem is that if he had taken that route, that wouldn't have been true to himself. It wouldn't have allowed him to develop himself into who he truly is, which I think his true self is, I guess you could sum it up in one word, a protector. That's who he is just down to the core, right?
Hmm.
Um, and it wouldn't have brought him to this journey, which in the end allows him to overcome his grief of his mother's passing, or as he calls it, putting an end to the reign at the end of the Soul Society. So, Teddy, there's this kind of idea right now between like Soren Kierkegaard and grief that grief is, you could say, a terminal on the journey to finding one's true self. Would you say that that is the case? Would you go as far as to say, as like Kierkegaard, that grief is necessary to finding your true self?
It depends it depends on the situation. It depends on what you find yourself in that's causing that grief, right? If you ask me personally, it's actually interesting that you brought that up because when I was thinking about, this topic when we're about to discuss it, I came to a conclusion not based on anything I've read. It was more so based on my own experiences, which is that there is a beauty in grief. Because most of the time, while you probably don't see it in the moment, it usually presents an opportunity for growth because you're given an option between growing from a situation and becoming better and stronger for it, or letting it consume you and defeat you essentially. Maybe not necessarily in the moment, but morally over time. And I wouldn't say that, kind of like that conversation we had before, where for growth, the stimulus for growth for people is different depending on their predisposition. For some, it's not gonna take a lot. For others, it's gonna take near death situations. So
Yeah.
I would say on this philosopher's approach to grief and look at it as a, you know somewhere to find purpose and meaning in your life, I'll say that it's true to an extent,
Hmm.
right? I feel like it's not. I don't think it's healthy to look at that as a necessary requirement for growth,
Yeah.
but it presents an opportunity for it if you allow it to be that.
Yeah, that's a fact. That's how I view like a lot of these concepts like love, grief, joy, sadness. Like I think we talked about it on the podcast on whether or not love is a social construct, but my belief on love is that like it can definitely help you to find your true self as well. So I do agree that like bleach can I mean that grief itself can be a door to the path on finding your true self, or the path to the light, as Kierkegaard calls it. But I don't think it's the only door. I think it's just one of many doors, and I would even maybe go as far as to say like that you need to go through all of these doors to find it. But I don't think that it's the only door. Like
Yeah, no,
he
because
seems to think.
when you think about it, right, there's different ways to deal with grief. Everybody approaches it differently.
Yeah,
And depending on that approach, it may lend itself to be an opportunity for growth or not. Because you think about this, right? For some people, and mind you, grief can be about anything. It's not necessarily just the loss of life, right? It could be the loss of a lifestyle,
yeah,
or, like I say, maybe over, to relate it to our current times. Let's say that you're living large before the pandemic, and then when it happened, you lost your main source of income. So now, there's a sense of grief in terms of you're mourning those days back when you used to make a lot more money. So now you have to embrace the fact that you're not there anymore and rebuild from the ground up, right? So there's some people, it just that grief is too much to bear, and they end up homeless.
Yeah.
or they take their own lives, God forbid, but that's just the way some people decide to deal with it because they're overwhelmed by that
Yeah.
feeling of loss, right? For other people, it's going to be something like, oh no, there is no way I am not losing. I'm going to rebuild this thing if that's the last thing I do, right? So for those people, it's a source of motivation. And then when they overcome it, it's like you become stronger for it because now you're capable of bouncing back from a situation like that. So it builds you and makes you stronger, right? Other people, they'll just act like it never happened and try to go about life. You're just kind of like somewhere in between those two examples I just gave you, where they try to find kind of a way to coast through life, not have to worry about it as much. So I broke it down in um three main ways to deal with grief. And I don't know if maybe you can come up with some more. Like those are the three that really stood out to me. So the first one is, fighting the grief and trying to win. So in that situation, it's like you're not willing to let it overcome you, right?
Yeah.
The second way is through detachment. So almost having like a nihilistic approach where you're just like, you know what, it is what it is. Let me just kind of go through life, not trying to think about it too much.
Yeah. Stoicism again, which we have to talk about. Oh man.
Yeah, yeah. That's
Eventually.
that's definitely going to come up again. And then, the last one is you basically, for lack of better words, roll over and die. Is this where you just decide that there's nothing to be done? You accept defeat and whatever comes of it, whether it be drugs, homelessness, a combination of the two, in the example I gave. But
Yeah.
like with Bleach, it's interesting because for the longest time, I felt like for Ichigo, it was a mix of detachment and also kind of finding it. I feel
Mm.
like it was more detachment until Rukia came into the picture.
Yeah, for sure.
Because before it was just like, this is kind of my life. Let me just go through it, and you can tell that he's always had that sense of protecting his close and loved ones, right? Like with Chad and all that. And that was from episode one, I believe. So very
Yeah.
early on, you kind of get a sense for the kind of person Ichigo is. But then when Rukia came into the picture, that's when he realized that, like you said, he obtained the power to do something about that grief, like in terms of making up for the fact that he couldn't save his mother. It's like, okay, I couldn't do it then, but now I can make a difference. So,
Yeah, exactly. And I'm glad you brought up kind of like the different ways we can deal with grief because I actually have like an example to bring up later revolving around Bleach. But just first, Kierkegaard has like an anecdotal example of how he saw somebody experiencing grief and getting over it. There's this woman named Anna that Kierkegaard met, and they say Anna is someone who followed Kierkegaard's advice. She had a great passion, her relationship with her husband. His love was the source of all meaning in her life, so it had a decisive significance for her. So for her, as Kierkegaard puts it, everything was perfect with their husband. But 7 years into their marriage, Anna's husband died. So, because her love for her husband ran so deep, Anna just couldn't move on. I mean, it kind of sounds familiar. It sounds a lot like Ichigo, right? He loved
mhm.
his mother so much, and she passes away. He couldn't even do anything about her, and it's almost like in his mind because of him, because if he would have never ran to the river, the Grand Fisher would have never, caught his mother. Um, so what Anna does, um, when her husband dies, she copes by turning to God. So she spends the rest of her remaining like days in her life praying and just fasting in this temple, right?
Mhm.
And you think about the study and you're like, well, she basically just husband died and she became a hermit and just like never talked to anybody else and just started praying and fasting in some random shack of a church. Like, why not just tell Anna to pick up the pieces and move on? Why not just encourage her to find a new partner? Somebody to help her forget the pain. And Kierkegaard adds that, you might even say, this is just how life goes. These things happen, people die. You can't just like recluse yourself just because of that. When you take risks, sometimes you lose. But when that happens, you don't give up. You get up and try again, right, Teddy? So he says, I suspect most of us would offer Anna a version of this optimistic advice. It's also what most of us would attempt ourselves if we were in her shoes. We'd go through a grieving period or process and then start over. It wouldn't be easy, of course, but we'd find a way. But he claims that this popular path isn't open to Anna. Why not? Because he says that if Anna did that, she wouldn't be true to herself if she moved on this way. So, in other words, Anna was not turning to God to cope. She was working on her spirit, she was working on herself and tuning out the world to overcome her grief. So, a lot of people hope for happiness from something out there, while others might find happiness or happiness interchangeable with the overcoming of grief from something within themselves. And that's why he argues that self is very important in overcoming grief. And I think, like you're describing it, the self was very important to overcoming grief for Ichigo, because it wasn't until he gained the power of a soul reaper that he was able to get over his mother's passing and become a stronger individual. And it was definitely a process for him. He didn't just become like a soul reaper and save Rukia and then like that was it for the rest of the story. It Even if you overcome the big hurdle, the rain can still always come back and you have a new strength to fight it, but the war isn't over, you know? Do you kind of see grief as that way, Teddy? Like, even if, let's say, like for this woman Anna, for example, she lost her husband. She can kind of one day come to terms with it, but once she does come to terms with it, that doesn't kind of exclude the the reality that there are days that it's just going to come back. You will never fully overcome it.
Yeah, and I think that's what is a really beautiful parallel between the story of that lady and Ichigo, because they kind of both went down the same path, except for one person, it was made to be a lot more hopeful, optimistic, and just healthier overall. And for the other one, it's more so kind of depressing, which is that in both cases, they're given or they take on a role that has the main purpose of addressing the source of that grief. So being a soul reaper, literally what it comes down to, especially in Ichigo's case, it's protecting Karakura from hollows, right? And then sending those souls to rest. So it really he basically was given the role of a protector, which is something that he needed for himself to deal with that grief. He was given a purpose through that. It's like your job now is to overcome that grief by being a soul reaper,
Yeah.
right? So he was given that function, and I helped him in this case. With that lady though, she took on that purpose for herself to try and deal with it by secluding herself and completely devoting herself to a life of faith, right? And praising the Lord. What I was
Praise
gonna
the Lord.
say, yeah, gospel.
Avoidance.
Um, but the thing with her is that, and it's going to go to something that I was going to bring up later, which is that um most of the time, the end goal of I would say that the end goal, but like the what it comes down to, most people's dealings with grief is acceptance, right? Over time, you just accept that that's just the state of affairs. and you just have to push on because the pain that you feel from that loss can only hurt so much. But let me ask you this: what happens when that pain never subsides or subsides, I guess?
Yeah. What happens
That's what
when?
happens with that lady,
Yeah.
where that pain is still there day after day. For most of us, time is I don't want to say a healing factor, but it just helps us deal with it better over time. But for some people, they can't get over it because it's so upsetting to them. Like they feel it on a level that most other people probably can't comprehend, and they accept it. Like in that lady's case, she accepted it. She realized this is something I may never get over for the rest of my life. So
Yeah.
let me try and find a way to work with it. Which, if you ask me, it's still pretty praiseworthy because I feel like most of the people in that situation, they would refuse to live in a constant state of pain like that. And if they couldn't find a way to deal with it, they just say, you know what, this is it for me,
Yeah.
right? And hang it up. She didn't do that. So I believe that's worthy of praise and acknowledgement, but at the same time, it's very difficult. It's
It's
a
very difficult.
very difficult journey to embark on when you realize that there's something that you can't get over like that. And I pray that something like that never happens to me because I don't know how I would deal because that's something, it's a foreign concept to me at the moment. I can't see myself being in a situation where I would grieve so hard that I wouldn't be able to get over it for years.
Yeah.
But in her case, that's what, so I'm like, I hope that never happens to me, man.
Yeah. And man, it's crazy because there's this other example of this other character in Bleach that gets overlooked. That also is a woman, um, that went through her own grief. Um, and that is Inoue Orihime. Uh, so this is the thing. She lost her brother to a hollow, right? And this is a major point of the story that sometimes is overlooked. But she actually ties into this kind of theme or idea of rain in Bleach, right?
Mm.
She has this quote where she says, "If I were rain that joins sky and earth that otherwise never touch, could I join two hearts as well?" Um, so that's the English translation. The Japanese translation is like the raw, authentic Japanese translation is, "If I were the rain, could I connect with someone's heart just as it can unite the eternally separated earth and sky?" So Orihime here, she's using the rain as a metaphor for the empathy and the ability to reach out for other people's soul, right? So it's the fact that rain falls down from the sky to reach the earth, obviously, right?
Yeah.
So she doesn't want to be in despair. And this came in an episode where she saw that Ichigo was in despair because of, he was depressed about his mother's passing. It was like, I think it was the anniversary of the passing, and they were kind of going through all the characters learning about it. Rukia or Hime, Chad, everybody. Some of them obviously knew about it already. So Orihime sees Ichigo on display, and she's like, I want to be able to reach for Ichigo in his pain, like the rain from the sky reaches the earth, because she feels very strongly for him and relates to his loss. She relates to that sense of grief. Um, and there's no coincidence in this, right? Because her name is Orihime, and the pilot of Bleach actually refers to the legend of Tanabata. It's a really long story, but to make it quick, it's basically the story of two lovers. Um, it's a Japanese story of two lovers that are separated, one living in the sky and the other on Earth. And basically, they're allowed to meet each other only once a year on the seventh night of like the seventh month or something like that. And if it rains that day, the lovers won't be able to meet. So it's this kind of little Kubo did a little play on that story, right?
Mhm.
With the whole Ichigo and Orihime relationship. And here, Orihime is subverting the story where, in the legend she got her name from, rain is used as something negative, right? And
Yeah.
in Ichigo's case, he sees the rain as something negative, right? It it prevents the two lovers from being reunited. But Orihime, the way that she's processing grief and the way that she's processing rain, it's actually a positive thing because it can help her to relate to somebody else that is also going through the same thing, and that it can actually unite, in other words, the earth and the sky, um as her heart's trying to kind of reach out for Ichigo, if that makes sense. So it's kind of grief allows her to develop her empathy for others and her compassion, whereas Ichigo sees only despair, or Hime sees empathy. And this is a way of showing that like Ichigo's despair is a thing was a thing that separated him from other people. So his belief kind of that the people he loves could be taken away from him at any second, and that he won't be strong enough to prevent it from happening. It prevents him from creating deeper bonds, and it kind of causes him to, like Kierkegaard said, become secretive and reclused and to himself. Um, and this is basically exemplified it. You see so many scenes of it, right? When Ichigo lost to Grimjow, he shut himself in his room for weeks. He wouldn't talk to even his little sisters. When he fought Grand Fisher, he shut down Rukia. He even run away from her, right? He didn't want to talk to her about his mother's death. So, and even the title of the chapter of that chapter is one way sympathies. So there's people that they're trying to help Ishigo, but he pushes them away because of everything that happened to his mother. So we see the way certain people process despair, like you're saying, Teddy, where Ichigo sees this as something negative, but Orihime was able to turn it into something positive. And I think a lot of people look at Orihime as very simple, like she has nothing to her character, and like Bleach just doesn't have many themes at all. But this is yet another example of something that goes overlooked. And I think Orihime is a very strong character actually because of this. And I think this is just a really interesting look on grief as well. What do you think, Teddy? Do you think that this is like that makes sense at all? Using grief to kind of form and develop empathy, and using that as a way to kind of connect with others.
Yeah, because when you look at it, this is one thing when I was saying earlier that the beauty of grief is that if you allow it, and depending on the circumstances, it can present an opportunity for growth. This is an example of it, where you learn by dealing with your own pain over a loss of any kind. You develop the ability to empathize with others because you know what it's like. So when you see somebody suffering from something similar or going through something similar to what you've been through, you're able to, even if you can't necessarily help them in any substantial way, at the very least you're able to empathize and be there for them in a meaningful way, right?
Yeah,
And you can create bonds that way because it's like, listen, I know you're hurting right now, but let me tell you, I've been there before. I've hurt, and this may not work for you, but let me give you some words of advice based on my experience, or let me help you get over this, right? Because I've been there, right? So that's another aspect of grace. It's not just like, oh, I'm tougher now because I got over it. No, it's more so like, yeah, I feel like you get a better understanding of the human experience when you deal with certain things like that.
yeah,
And like I feel like you become better, well-rounded as an individual.
yeah,
You
yeah,
know.
definitely. I remember there was in high school, I had a friend that I was pretty close to, and I think like maybe 2 years out of high school, he was he unfortunately passed away. He was killed in
Oh,
I think a drunk driving incident or something like that. And And basically, when I went to the funeral, I saw a lot of faces from high school. A lot of people I just didn't normally just talk to throughout that whole kind of experience in high school.
Yeah.
And when I saw them, we were able to connect in that moment because we were all sharing the same grief. So I definitely do see that side of the overcoming of grief, like Orihime's side of well, this is really sad, but at the same time, I feel like this can allow me to connect to others as well, and kind of help them heal. Which I mean, Orihime is all about healing, where Ichigo is a protector, and he feels like if he can't protect, that he's basically useless, and he's gonna cast himself away. Orihime sees grief as an opportunity to heal and to connect with others, which is something really powerful, and that's something that I've definitely seen and experienced in times that I've grieved. Even in a really um, simple example, like don't even think about like the a death or a funeral, right? Maybe you've worked at a place like a restaurant, or you've worked in retail for like a year or so, and you all got really close to this one coworker, right?
Yeah.
And let's say they move, they leave, they're no longer working there, and there's some people that you almost never talk to, but because this person left and they love them just as much as you did, you kind of start talking about them. Oh, I miss them so much. Yeah, I miss them too. They used to do this and that. And before you know it, you're actually connecting with others you never thought you would have connected with. And it's all because you kind of went through this form of grief. Now, albeit it's a very small small portion of grief. It's not a massive grief like having someone, die in front of you or anything like that. But it just kind of goes to exemplify it. I think even Kendrick Lamar said in a recent song, he was like, "I grieve different." So grief is something that we kind of all process differently, and all kind of overcome differently. And I think that kind of ties into the Kierkegaardian grief, where grief can be only overcome by like your true self, or it's a door on the path to finding your true self, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this is I feel like you can say that about most challenges or hardships in life, which is that when your response in those kinds of situations show you what you're really made of, right? And it, I don't know. For me, I've always been in the camp of don't don't necessarily wait for that to do introspective work on yourself. So don't wait for something like any kind of loss to happen to you to work on yourself. Like, I'll give you an example, right? Um, I had a conversation with a close friend of mine few months back, maybe about a year now. They asked me, "Do you have a comfort object?" Do you know what that is?
Comfort object, like just something that you keep close, and it kind of
Something that,
eases anxiety or whatever.
yeah, exactly. Something like that that brings you comfort, and you have it around you, and you're able to see it, touch it, smell it, whatever the case may be. It comforts you, like it puts you at ease. You have something like that?
Me, no, honestly.
Yeah, I don't either. And when I told her that, she was like, "Wow, really? You don't have anything like that?" It's like, and I told her, "Yeah, because the way I look at life, nothing is ever still. Everything changes. That's just the nature of life. Like nothing stays the same. Even if it's cyclical, nothing stays the same, right? There
Mhm.
always be some change at some point. Because of that, I look at most things I own as I have these things now, but nothing is to say that I'm always going to have them. So I never get attached to anything because I refuse to have my peace and my mental well-being be dependent on an object that I could lose at any point in time.
Yeah.
So the very notion of comfort object to me is problematic because you're basically setting yourself up for a situation where you will experience some kind of loss or some kind of grief over losing that stuff because you're putting so much meaning and power into it, right?
Yeah.
Where for me, I always try to work on myself. I always try to build myself and not put myself in situations where I'll have to deal with something like that.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm always of the mindset of don't wait. Basically, stay ready so you don't have to get ready when something happens.
Yeah.
Right. But that's not a popular thought these days, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Uh,
Definitely. Like I don't see like comfort objects as maybe being a viable way to, like, at least it's not a strong viable way to overcome grief or depression or anxiety or anything like that. I mean, of course, with a grain of salt, if it works for you, obviously don't stop just because a random schmuck is saying it on YouTube like
I
me.
know, right? We're not experts, remember?
Yeah, we're not experts, remember, but me Teddy, I saw this person once, right?
Yeah.
That was a close friend. They were grieving the loss of someone very close to them, right? A family member very, very close to them. And they had these desires in life. Well, they still do. They have these desires in life to, like, you know, open up a business or, you know, uh, get back in shape since the loss and everything. But when they lost this person, it was when they were very young, right? It was when Cartoon Network was still around and Toonami, Adult Swim, Dragon Ball Z days,
Yeah.
and those were their kind of heydays because their loved one was still around and they they weren't experiencing this kind of deep despair. And now it's kind of holding them back because instead of having a comfort object, I feel like they have more of a comfort activity or a comfort, I guess, kind of routine in each of their days. So they'll come back from home from work, or it'll be the morning before work, and they will just stay home all day, rewatching reruns of like shows that used to play when they were a kid.
Oh,
And instead of doing anything new or doing what you could say their soul or their true self wants to do, which is maybe go to the gym, go for a walk, get out there, try some new hobbies, things that they've expressed that they want to do, but they just never do, because they're just sitting down all day, like, watching shows and stuff like that, like watching old reruns and keeping themselves miserable, right?
yes.
Um, this is where I kind of see that Soren Kierkegaardian grief exemplified, where sometimes you can process grief, and if it's not true to yourself, it's going to destroy you, and it's going to put you in a it's going to keep you on the path of grief and despair, because then you're going to start regretting everything. You're going to be like, oh, I wasted so much time, and I should have been doing this, I should have been doing that, and I just haven't. And you just like and the more you think like that, the more you sink into the hole, the more you become a recluse, and you just like you keep digging that hole. So I definitely do think that's a slippery slope as well. That's something that I've seen in some people, and I definitely have seen it myself. We've seen it in Ichigo in the story, right? Like when he lost to Grimjow, he stayed in his room for weeks when he could have been training, when he could have been gearing up for the Soul Society. You know what I'm saying? Like I mean for the Arankar arc.
I think for him, like at that point in time, it was a shock
It was
because
a shock, yeah.
he was completely outclassed. 'Cause mind you, he was coming back with a lot of sauce because he had mastered Hollow Form, right? So he thought he was the man. Like he had a lot of confidence, and that got shut down so quick when Grimjaw essentially treated him like a punching bag.
Yeah,
Like it was literally a punching bag. Like Ichigo was a punching bag from Grimjaw. My man did not even release any of his forms the first time they met. I'd be in shock too. I'd be like, whoa, this dude didn't even break a sweat and he just rocked my stuff. Like, like Millie rocked. Like that, it was not pretty. It was not
yeah,
also. I understand he'd be in a state of shock and kind of trying to get over that, but he eventually he did because
Yeah, he did. He did.
it, that's what he does. But it's one thing I was gonna mention also is that just because you're grieving doesn't mean your life has to stop. I don't know. Maybe it's not something that's advisable or recommendable to everybody, but um I've experienced grief over a relationship in recent times, and it was debilitating emotional pain. But I was at work and I powered through it. So some may say it may not necessarily be the healthiest approach, but that's just kind of what I found that I had to do because I realized, listen, just because I'm hurting, just because I'm in pain, doesn't mean the world stops. It still keeps going, and I have to keep going with it. Eventually, I'll get over this. Well,
Yeah.
not, but it won't affect me as much, right? Because if I'm going to be honest with you, if you ask me, "Are you over that?" No, I'm not. To the And I have a constant reminder around me of the fact that I'm not. It's just I deal with it, you know, and it's something that I don't understand why we live currently in a generation where you're just not taught to deal with things sometimes. There's nothing wrong with it. I don't know at what point it became unhealthy to just deal with your pain and keep pushing. It's really not that bad. I enjoy life still, even in doing this, in just pushing on. It's fine. It doesn't negatively affect me on a day-to-day basis. So for me, I just don't understand why it gets vilified nowadays that no, you shouldn't have to push through the pain. You should just stop and find a way to heal and everything. And for me, this is an unpopular opinion, of course, but for me, I don't believe in that. If you if something ever really mattered to you or someone and you lose them, let me ask you this. If you completely get over it, how much did that ever matter to you, or how much did that ever matter to you?
Yeah.
You see
That's
what I'm
why. That's why I say it's important. Like, not important, but like, well, yeah, I guess it's important to realize that even if you like overcome the obstacle, like, it can always come back. So I think that's why maybe rain is like a perfect metaphor for it, because like, even if the rain goes away one day, it can always come back, right?
Yeah.
Now, when it comes back, you've learned to overcome it in the sense that now you have an umbrella. Whereas before you didn't have an umbrella for it, right? You were just wallowing in it. You're just like, oh my God, this is so horrible. But now you have an umbrella where even when you remember it, like let's say the anniversary comes around of for Ichigo, right? The anniversary of his mother's death comes around. He's able to handle it now because he is able to look at her and say, "You would have become proud of who I am now, mom," or whatever he has to, however he has to look at it to kind of come to terms with what happened. So that's the way I look at it. I don't think it should ever be something that it's just like, well, this person died. Well, I'm over it. Oh, screw that. Screw that. Who cares about that anymore? Like, on to the next episode. You know, it's
Hmm.
just that's just something that I don't think is ever. I mean, it might happen, but I just don't see how that could happen, man. I don't see how people could do that. Could go that far to that extreme. You know?
Yeah, that's why I always question when they're able to do that. Did you did they ever matter to you, or whatever you whatever was your source of grief or your grievances?
If you truly grieve, you know.
Exactly. Like, was that ever real? Because I personally believe it's impossible to just like, oh yeah, I'm good now. Like I'm over it. Like some
Yeah.
people would be like, oh yeah, I still remember it, and it still kind of sucks. It's like, no, for me, it's just it's still very real. Like,
Teddy, like when you
yeah,
have a girlfriend, when you're really young, like you're a kid and you have like your girlfriend in high school or middle school or something like that,
yeah.
and you break up with them, or she breaks up with you, and you're like, oh, I'm so sad, this is awful, I hate life or something for like a day, and then the next day, like, you're just like, oh, who cares about this, like, it doesn't even matter. Like, that's basically what that is. Like, I
Yeah,
wouldn't even call that grief. Like, I would ask you this, Teddy, like, is it, well, maybe not ask you, but I know for me, whenever I've truly grieved, like Kierkegaard said, it's almost like I've unlocked something in myself, and myself has developed, or I've realized something, I've learned something from it, you know?
yeah,
I don't know if you've experienced that too.
yeah. That's essentially what it is, because you're given a you're presented with an opportunity to learn from something that you don't experience every day. You
Yeah,
know, it's not every day that you lose something that matters a lot to you. If that's your everyday, your life is miserable. I hope nobody lives like that. But it's not every day that something like that happens, especially if it's something that truly meant something to you.
yeah,
Right. That's why I can't be going around willy-nilly and saying, oh yeah, like this matters to me so much and everything. And that's why I always live, and some people may call it depressing, but I always live with a constant reminder in the back of my head that nothing is permanent. Everything is fleeting. Our very lives, the nature of our very lives is fleeting. You can't expect anything to last forever, right? Because it just doesn't. And so that's why I always, the whole mantra of expect the worst but hope for the best. That's how I approach grief. Because the example that you gave about, even something as, I don't want to say mundane, but maybe not necessarily not as heavy as a loss of a close one, loved ones, I should say, at work. Right? You have a coworker that you really enjoy working with, and then they leave for whatever reason, or something's change. It can really affect your experience at work. But guess what? The way I see it, it was gonna happen at some point anyway. If he wasn't there, it may have been me leaving.
yeah,
Right. So that's my approach every time, where it's like, yeah, it's a bummer. Yeah, it's gonna suck. Not just for now. It's gonna suck for a while because I enjoy working with this person. But guess what? It is what it is. So I'm like, I'm gonna keep pushing through and
yeah,
make it happen. But the reason I'm able to do that is because I have that preset notion in my mind that it was gonna happen at some point anyway. So when
mm,
it does, yes, it still sucks, but at least I'm mentally and emotionally prepared for it.
yeah. And like, for Kierkegaard, despair and grief, they're kind of tied to the self, right? And so he says how much of a self you realize will affect how much despair it carries. So, in other words, when you come to know yourself, you will come to know the way to escape despair, to escape grief. And it's kind of an interesting concept because it's like he was a theologian, right? You got to note this. He was a theologian, and he you got to realize he basically believed that the self could only be discovered in God. So he had a very specific belief, right? But also, according to him, an individual is in despair if he does not align himself with God or with God's plan for the self. So he has a very specific way of looking at it, but basically, um, in that way, you're losing yourself. You know, when you completely give into grief, you're losing yourself. Like, obviously, he has this theological side of looking at it, but just from a philosophical aspect, he thought that individuals in despair are those who seek to deny their authentic selves to flee particular aspects of their character, their past or the world, or just even in order to deny their own mission. So he had three concepts of the true self, or just of the self in general, right? He has the concrete self. So the concrete self is who you are now. So you're a dude who lives in Albuquerque, you live in Milwaukee, you own a Subway sandwich restaurant chain. You have a wife, you have two kids, you have a dog, you like bike riding, and you're a generous guy, but sometimes you get angry about money, you know?
Hmm.
So that's the concrete self. Then you have the ideal self. The ideal self is the self you want to be. You want to be a millionaire. You want to be 20 pounds lighter. You want to be an Iron Man. You want to be calmer. You want to be the guy, the man. You want the ideal self. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then he has the true self. So the true self, in his words, is the self that God wants you to be. Or also, in his other words, the true self is the self rested transparently in God. So to kind of put this on Ichigo, I feel like the concrete Ichigo is Ichigo, him as like a brother to Yuzu and Karen, him as a high schooler, him as a son, him as just like his everyday life in Karakura Town, right?
Mhm.
And his ideal self, like what he sees as him being ideal, is actually kind of already what he is as concrete, right? Because we saw this in the Fullbring arc. What he wanted all along was to live with no powers, living a normal life in his little town with all his friends and just chilling. But you know what? The true self, who he truly needs to be, and who he truly wants to be inside, and who he's called to be, is Ichigo the Soul Reaper, the Protector, the man, the one who's gonna take care of business and protect everybody, and that's who he needs to be. And in this way, you can kind of see how grief can bring us to confront these aspects of ourselves and bring us to discover our true self and who we truly are, and not who just we think we are or who we are now, but who we are to become, and who we're always destined to be, in a sense, if
Okay.
that makes any sense.
Yeah. That's the thing. Like I I I don't know because grief is such a particular kind of experience. I don't know how much of that lends itself to making us like be our true selves. The way I see it is more so like something like grief, it tests your ability to adapt, to change to certain situations. Like, because if you don't experience it, does that mean that you're not able to be your true self? I mean, because mind you, I understand grief, it is part of the human experience, right? Like, I feel like at any level, most everybody will experience some kind of grief, right? But I don't know if you can say even that all forms of grief can be character defining, because sometimes there's certain things you lose and you just kind of accept pretty quickly that you lost them. And it's like, well, you know what, this means nothing. Feel like, especially because like parents or grandparents, things like that their day will come, right? Like that they're probably going to die before you. So I don't know how much of that, for example, you can say, oh, it really defines your character, or it helps you find your true self. Because if this is just part of the human experience anyway, how much of that is really character defining, because you think about it, it's like, well, your mom and dad, they're probably going to leave this earth before you, right? So then in that case, when the day comes when that happens, since you knew it was something that was going to happen anyway, do you think that will affect you on a level where you find yourself becoming more of who you really are?
Yeah, definitely. I think it helps develop and form who you are. I think that's what we talked about before, right? Like with the examples of like the people who, like, maybe they had a parent who died, or a cousin who died or something, and or a friend who passed away, and they become recluse, they become reclusive, right? And then they just stay at home all day, just like doing nothing, right? And they deny themselves of being who they truly want to be, right? And then
Yeah.
you have the people that they lose their parents or whatever, and they kind of just say to themselves, or they go to the funeral and say, whisper to their parents, listen, I'm gonna be everything you want to be, or I'm gonna make you proud. And they maybe they always had that in them, right? But this moment, or this event, this tragic event, pushes that even further, and develops it even more.
I guess
Where
the way I look at it is more so I feel like there's a difference between when it's expected or timely and when it's an untimely death.
Yeah,
Like if your parents died in an unpredictable car accident versus if they just die of old age, I feel like how that affects you would be different because in one situation you knew it was going to happen, it was inevitable, where in the other you weren't expecting it, it was untimely, right? So I feel like the untimely death or the untimely scenario would be where there's the most potential for you to either grow or regress
yeah,
versus if it's something that, oh, it was bound to happen, it doesn't quite affect you like that. So I don't know, that's kind of how I look at it. I think it's a different kind of stimulus for
yeah.
growth.
It depends on if it's even grief or not. Like if it's untimely, and then you face a real grief, then I mean it's grief. But if it's like something you expect, and you're just like whatever about it, then it's
I mean, it's
technically
still
not even
loss,
grief. I mean,
technically.
it's a loss, but it's not grief. Grief has to do with how you process the loss. That's how I see it, at least. Like for example, like when we are talking about the girlfriend breaking up with a girlfriend, right? Like it's a very temporal grief, and when you look back at it, like was it even grief? Was it even true grief? But like for example, like if like you said, you experienced a really really big grief in your life, like that was the true grief for you. And I feel like it's the grief itself would be different for everybody, right? Like what everybody grieves is going to be different. Like I feel like most of us aren't going to grieve if we spill over a cup of milk um on the table. And obviously something like that isn't going to help us develop as a person in ourselves. But and I'll just finish with this also, because we're almost about to hit an hour.
Oh wow.
Um but it's the grief that we actually accept as grief within ourselves. Like we're actually able to say, man, this is awful. There can be value in that, in developing yourself as a person through that, and finding your true self. It definitely can be a door to finding your true self, and it definitely was a door for Ichigo and Orihime and multiple other characters in Bleach to finding their true self. And Bleach wasn't the only anime that kind of goes into grief, and we're definitely going to get into that into the future study. But before that, do you have any kind of last closing thoughts on this kind of crazy, big, esoteric topic?
Ah man, listen, it's another heavy one, and I feel like everybody's experience with grief on any level is different, and in no way would I ever try to deny somebody's experience. It's just like I feel like if you ask me personally, it's best to go through life expecting loss to happen in any area of your life at any point in time.
Yeah,
It might not make it any less painful, but at least it gives you kind of some way of preparing for it so it doesn't hit you as hard.
nice. Yeah, that's really powerful. And with that, you guys, this was a really great podcast. I think we got into the topic very deep, and I think we shed some light on some hidden themes of Bleach and Kierkegaardian grief, which is kind of an esoteric topic. And we hope it was interesting for you guys to listen as much as it was for us to talk about it. Um, and yeah, nothing much more to say other than that, I guess. With that, we are out. Peace.
Peace.